Hi, everybody. So I guess we're going to review the evolutionary stages as I studied with Jeffrey in the 90s and my own experience of observing them, correlating and observing people's situations, people's lives, people's stories, and really very much asking them where they're at, and also observing people in the spotlight, people in our worlds who I think we can examine their lives and see a little bit about what might be going on with them. So I think our first slide will be about the stages themselves, consensus, individuating, and spirituality, which are also known in the psychological model as codependent, independent, and interdependent. So you'll hear me say consensus and codependent, and I mean the first stage. And then when I talk about individuation or independence, I'm talking about Uranus. So stage 1 is ruled by Saturn, the rule giver, and stage 2 is ruled by Uranus, the rule breaker. And stage 3 is Neptune, our interdependence and our spirituality. The planet that rules the divine, the chaos. And then above all of it, of course, is our Pluto, our evolutionary journey itself. And in these 3 stages, we have the establishing stage, I think we call it, and that would be the first part of Saturn stage, which would be Saturn. And that would be consensus. And that would be a person, if you've listened to my video that's on Vimeo, someone who, it's Tuesday night, we eat pizza and we watch Dancing with the Stars. Are you in or are you out? Well, that's what we do, and there's no questioning it. That's what we do. And Uranus, the consensus stage, but individuating, would be that same person going, yeah, I'm going to go bowling. I'm sick of Dancing with the Stars. You heard you. They would make fun. And they would want to be asserting their own will at that point. The Uranus would have kicked in. And in consensus spiritual or codependent, interdependent, they would have joined the church choir, and they're still very much involved in the consensus. And this is where we would find maybe the Pope even. He's in the consensus, but he's in a spiritual stage. So as a person who's deeply religious, even a guru like of an Eastern tradition, a Swami or something, they would be in this consensus spiritual. They wouldn't be in Saturn, in interdependence or spiritual stage 1. People confuse the stage 3 part of phase 1, the Saturn phase of consensus, with stage 1, phase 3, all right? Because they look a lot alike. So you can walk into a temple and see a very spiritual group of people meditating, but they're really praying to this idea of a consensus God, all right? So I think the consensus stage is fairly easy to understand. It's a Saturn stage, and within it are the Saturn, Uranus, Neptune aspects of it. The individuated stage, we meet a lot of people in our world there. And since only 6% of us are in the spiritual stage, 94% are in these 2 stages. So in the first stage of individuated is people who are nonconformists, but they're consensus nonconformists. So one of the examples that I think is kind of funny is there's this thing called Comic-Con, and it's become very popular. It's like a Star Wars kind of convention, and people go to that and they all dress up because they're in a consensus. They're all part of this, individuating experience of being part of Comic-Con. And that's my really good description for the Saturn. They want to be part of a consensus. They go in a group, but they all have their own unique, weird costumes on. And then Uranus, I think Jeffrey talked about this as someone like Picasso, painters and rock stars. He said we're in individuating. Which when you think about it, they really are. They break all the rules. They break their guitars. They're pretty funny. And they're very contrapuntal, okay? Directors, people in the arts are very much in this Uranus group, very angry. The individuating stage is always kind of angry. If you meet people who are angry, they're probably in an individuating stage. And then Uranus Neptune, I think, is something that the phase 3 of stage 2, we'll call it that way, the phase and the stage. I'm making that up, but the stage I know, but I don't know what they call, if they call it phases or not in really strict verbiage here, but that's where we find the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs and the Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Bernie, and everybody's here. Trump is here. They're all here. This is, you might not want to use the word spiritual as much as you want to talk about individuating, independent, or individuating, interdependent. So what happens is they individuate, they come up with this great idea. They're not copying necessarily anybody. They're pioneering, they're individuating, they're geniuses. And they make a computer, but it's for everybody. And that's the interdependent part of it. And they make sure it's for everybody. You know, Bill Gates gets his computers into the schools. Apple got into the schools. So, but this aspect of this Uranus-Neptune gets a little bit hard to recognize because it is the filmmakers, it's the people who are affecting the imaginative will of others. Neptune being, I call it imaginative will. Sorry, my nose is running a little bit. I apologize. So the Uranus-Neptune, imaginative will. Imaginative will is a word I got from the Rosicrucians. And when we look at Dane Rudjah's chart, he's out of that whole theosophy lineage. And so that's a word they use for Neptune that I like a lot. So then the spiritual, stage 3, is the one probably that most of us here would like to think that we're in. Saturn, spiritual consensus. You'll find people who go to yoga classes, and if you do Ashtanga yoga, but they do Hatha yoga, you're not doing it right. Saturn, you've got it wrong. Consensus. So, or if everybody wears orange and they meditate at 4 a.m. and you show up in white or black, God forbid, you're not a member of the herd, all right? And so that's when you know that there's the consensus aspect, is when there's some kind of role playing and copying. The copying part seems to be the Saturn, and the Uranus seems to be, I'm going to make something new for everybody. And then Neptune is, well, how are we all connected in all of this? What's the oneness of all of it? So the New Age is replete with this spiritual consensus phase, this stage 3 phase, where everybody is trying to copy, well, which aromatherapy works for that? I mean, we have so many jokes in Los Angeles because it is just mecca for the New Age here. And my friends and I have like little books and notes about things you hear in the New Age. I can't remember them now, but they're really funny, like my karma ran over my dog, what kind of stuff. That's so old, that one, but new ones. And those come out of this Saturn, this need to conform, but to conform to our spiritual stage, which is, Neptune is very chaotic, in my humble opinion, and you get glimpses of how the divine is working as you become stiller and stiller through meditation. So a person who's in the stage 1, spiritual consensus, has to have some sort of spiritual discipline. Or they're a looky-loo and they're just sort of visiting it from the last stage. And then as we move forward and we get to Uranus-Neptune, well, you can imagine Uranus-Neptune in a combination with each other. It's a person who's breaking all the rules, trying to learn not to make copies of anything, trying to figure out how everything's connected, but wanting to individuate. And Jeffrey said this was one of the hardest ones. The individuating second phase of all these stages is the hardest one to get through in some ways, because you have to go through it on your own terms. And of course, wherever Neptune's involved, you have to surrender. And so this Uranian, they don't surrender. Aquarians don't surrender. They're very willful until they learn, as we all have to learn in the spiritual stage, to align our will with divine will, all right? Personal will with divine will. Separating desires with desires that will help us actually go forward on our evolutionary momentum. And so this stage, you find people like, what's his name, Tony Robbins, and you find people, the ones who are having difficulty, maybe Werner Erhard and these kind of people in the beginning of this second stage where there's so much ego, there's so much Uranus, there's so much me. And yet they're talking about interdependence. And so then they get boosted up. I'm sorry if you can hear my dryer in the background. They get boosted up and they have to completely surrender their ego and their sense of individuation and as they move through this second stage. And, you know, I have actually counseled some people in this stage, and it's hard. They're pretty stuck. Big egos, big, because of the interdependence, the understanding of that, being a little bit ahead of other people, and then having the ability to use their Uranian energy to get groups together and amass the masses and influence people. Then their ego gets more and more enraptured with that. Jeffrey said mostly for people to be in the second stage, they will have written a book and they will have a certain amount of fame when they're in these second stages, like Picasso and the rock stars do. I don't really remember the Saturn codependence. I would think that would be like mayors of cities in the second stage of consensus. Those kind of people who are enforcing the rules, maybe at like a Jerry Brown, maybe, you know, I don't know. And then Neptune, spiritual, Gandhi and Mother Teresa come to mind, very selfless individuals who clearly we've observed their life and it was not about themselves. And that's interdependent, very, very surrendered to the flow of the divine. And I think as we, as astrologers, are working on our spiritual evolutionary momentum, we're all hopefully somewhat grounded in the spiritual third stage, moving through it. And when I was learning this, Kristen Fontana was there for a couple of days, and she and I talked about it, and she said to me she felt that maybe we were in all of them all of the time, a little bit in all of them all of the time. And I think it's really important to realize that some of your relationships are very consensus. There's certain things, like you go to dinner, you don't feel like arguing. You find out someone's voting for someone you don't like, and do you want to really sit there and fight with them? You know, you've got 1 hour, and there's a Trump person in the midst, and you're like, okay, what do you do? So I think if you're really in the spiritual stage, you just see that this is an aspect of yourself, and there's no projection and no zero outside anymore. You just get, okay, this is some dimension of reality here that I'm also a part of. And you try to watch even the Donald Trumps of the world and see yourself and go, wow, what aspect of me is this? And I know when Liz Green wrote about Hitler in her book, Transits and the Outer Planets, she talked about how he was a reflection of all of us and our collective unconscious at the time. I remember how daunting that idea was way back in the 70s. And when Rudyard will look at his chart, which is so amazing, started to write about spiritual astrology and karmic astrology, it was daunting. He really had very forward ideas that came out of a theosophic movement. Blavatsky published his books. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Does anyone want to ask me anything? Well, we wait for the slide to go open. If you do, just unmute and bark away. But otherwise, Linda said it takes a few minutes for these slides to appear. So here's Saturn. The first stage, consensus reality. If we have a strong Saturn, we don't question the existing rules. We accept the dogma. We crave acceptance and wish to fit in. It's the psychological condition of codependence. I think because the Saturn and the Moon rule the 4th and the 10th house, on some level, when we're involved with our family, it's pretty hard to be looking at our interdependence. Unless you have enough gifted Neptune where you can see your past lives with that person and what you're working on. You can go to the next one, Linda. I think it's pretty hard for you to not be in a codependent phase with your own family. And I think it's okay to recognize the different relationships we have with different people. So Uranus second stage, this is what Jeffrey called the angry stage, delivers us from freedom from the known, to use his beautiful expression, and I think Krishnamurti used it as well, teaches us to embrace impermanence. And I think that this stage, we really have to, as we individuate, accept impermanence all the way through it. That was a Tibetan Buddhist idea that I picked up along the way. But I find that whenever Uranus transits come along, people are subjected to huge amounts of be here now tests and impermanence, and they have to accept it. And if they do, Uranus transits are easier. And if they don't, they're difficult. And I do think that the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in the 60s started the Aquarian age. And I love this quote from T.S. Eliot. In order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by a way which is the way of ignorance. In order to possess what you do not possess, you must go by the way of dispossession. It's just beautiful, isn't it? In order to arrive at what you are not, you must go through the way in which you are not. And what you do not know is the only thing you know. And what you own is what you do not own. And where you are is where you are not. And I think as Pluto is squaring Uranus through 2018, it's wide now, but it's still there. And just this last passage of the sun going through Libra and the eclipse in Aries Libra was, for me, very much tests of impermanence for all of us and individuation. And so that stage for all of us of individuation where we outgrow copying everything is important. And it's always part of our growth. You can't just say, oh, I'm in this Neptune third stage and I'm never have to deal with Saturn or Uranus. Watch your transits. That will not be true. So you'll begin to have maybe my feeling that you're in all of them. And then this lovely Neptune one, I mean, when we start to get Neptune right, you are the soul of the universe, and your name is love, Rumi. That bliss that Neptune promises, when you get there, it's pretty lovely. And so since Neptune is in Pisces and will be very prominent all year, the victim martyrdom is the EA theme for Virgo Pisces. And so all of us working on our third stages, which will reveal our interdependence and assist us with our spiritual evolution, must confront our victim martyrdom. So if you're working with yourself or you're working with others and they don't have any challenges with victim martyrdom when there's strong Neptune transits through their chart, pretty much in my humble opinion, they're not seeing things clearly, all right? Because I believe that as we evolve, we work on these collective issues of the outer planets together. So in Neptune, as we go through the stages, we begin to realize we're the projector and the projection. And a way which becomes the way is not the way. A name which becomes the name is not the name. So there's some very beautiful mantras that I really like. And one of them says, sustainer, liberator, enlightener, infinite, creator, destroyer, nameless, desireless. And it's kind of like that's a way of describing the beautiful mantra which describes Neptune. And so as you work with Neptune, you will dismantle your patterns of reaction to others, okay? And you will recognize that the meaning that's of what's actually going on, the depth of Neptune will pull you deeper when you get out of victim martyrdom and you start to accept responsibility. You will no longer be distorting things. So somebody didn't keep their word to me recently, and I thought, oh, what word am I not keeping to myself? And I realized what it was. I'm trying to diet and it's really hard. And so, that's me not keeping my word to myself. So easily someone else can come up and not keep their word to me. And that's what, as Neptune, you have to keep accepting these things. And then I think this is from Rob Bresney. All of creation is conspiring to shower us with blessings. Life is crazily in love with us. Brazenly and innocently in love with us. The universe always gives us exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. This is this understanding that Neptune delivers to you, that everything is perfect. The winds and the tides are on our side forever and ever, amen. The fire and the rain are scheming to steal our impossible pain. The sun and the moon and the stars remember our real names, and our ancestors pray for us while we're dreaming. We have guardian angels. Oh, wow. And thousands of teachers, provocateurs with designs to unleash us, helpers and saviors we can't even imagine, brothers and sisters who want us to blossom. Thanks to them, for whom the blissful blessings flow. We are waking up. And that is the third stage. He's a wonderful astrologer. He's not an evolutionary astrologer, he's a poet and just an advocator for spiritual shamanistic wisdom. Very poetic, Rob Bresney, who I love. I don't have time to read him that much. Okay, so we're back to this one. These are the evolutionary stages, which we've looked at, Linda. And then let's look at Steve Jobs. So we know a lot about this man's life, and I'm pretty sure that he is in the individuating stage. He made something for all of us, and interdependence. So the third stage of individuating. Now, I don't know for sure. I've never met him. I've read books and articles about him, and I've seen the movies made about him, but I haven't met him. So I couldn't observe and correlate, and I could be missing many things. So I'm only going to guess, and I certainly wouldn't want to be quoted as, she said he's in this stage and he's in it. I don't know. I don't know him, and I think it's dangerous. And also, maybe we're all in a little bit of it. But so what I do when I'm looking at a chart, if I have a client and I'm working with them, and I work with my clients on a yearly basis. I have some clients who get readings with me, but for the most part, I prefer to have people sign up to work with me either every other week or every week, so that I can help them with their evolutionary gateways and paths and challenges. I think it takes a lot to help people who really want to get there. No, I don't think, like these Zoom meetings that are weekly are wonderful, because I think we need weekly guidance. And so I'm happy to help if I can. So the first thing, of course, in an evolutionary chart we look at is the Mars-Pluto relationship and the nodes, and, just depending on which order you want to look in. And we see that he has the lovely closing trine between Mars and Pluto from Aries to Leo. And we know he was a pioneer, and we know he got a lot of financial support in order to pioneer. And Pluto in the 12th house in Leo, to be very creative. He brought us music that we could listen to, personal computers. We didn't have these things before he came along. And of course, what describes that? If we delineate his chart, we see the Mars-Pluto trine, and then we see the nodes in Cancer, Capricorn. And so Saturn ruling his south node is in Scorpio, ruled by that Pluto in Leo, ruled by that Sun in Pisces, ruled by that Neptune in Libra, which then goes to Venus in Capricorn and back to Saturn and back to Neptune. So we have this final board of directors between Venus, Saturn, and I would say Saturn, Juno, and Neptune. And so here's a very creative person, a leader, person who's involved in figuring out self-empowerment, Juno, and partnership, and Neptune, a visionary, a person with an imaginative will, which is ruled by a Capricorn Venus, conjunct a North Node and a Ceres, a person who wants to nurture. And that South Node has a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. So it looks like he was an inventor before this life, to me. Ruled by that moon, that South Node is ruled by that moon in Aries. And the moon is, what is the aspect? It's a sesquiquadrate between the Saturn and the moon. I didn't look that up. But so that relationship shows a lot of tension. Just being Aries Scorpio shows a lot of adjustments. But it looks like it's a sesquiquadrate. Someone can check it if they want for me and let me know. So the moon ruling that South Node, Jupiter-Uranus, talks about all of the projections people had onto him. The public, especially, the moon rules the public, and if you're looking at the chart at a horary level. So if we begin to look at his stages, when we look at Saturn first to look at how he's doing with the consensus, we see that he's got Saturn ruling his north node, the consensus stage, with Ceres and Venus involved and Neptune involved. So they're all in accord, and it's conjunct Juno. So we can see he's got a lot of work to do to get to his north node. And he's probably going to have a lot of consensus conflicts because Saturn's very busy. And so whether he works those out in the first stage of individuating or the first stage of spiritual or the first stage of consensus, because we know his life, he certainly worked them out in all of them. He had a lot of problems with his family, the consensus. He had problems with his partner and his ideas, struggling who was what with Wozniak. And probably in the first stage of spirituality, the consensus, he didn't really seem to fit, that I know of, in there either. So, but I think he was trying to get there personally. I wouldn't know unless I spoke to him. And then to look at his second stage ruler, Uranus, it's conjunct Jupiter, so he's a way shower with Jupiter. He's trying to learn more about natural law, but he also knows quite a lot about it because of that conjunction to his south node. And for me, it's not too wide. I don't really care what other people use. It's just looking at this man's life, it's not too wide for me at all. And the moon squares the nodes, and it's the ruler of the south node, so his own parents couldn't keep him. There's the square to the moon, and the square to Ceres, conjunct the north node. And he had a lot of problems with the public and with his image all the way through. And marriage, he had problems with marriage and relationship, which I think he resolved. I think by the time he died, he had been happily married for a long time and had 3 children with her, from what I know. And so I think we would look at this individuating stage and we would see this person in the individuating stage who is certainly interested in teaching. And he is born in the 50s when Uranus and Neptune were square. And so this is the square that when I was first studying this, Liz Green talked about it, and it stayed with me all these years in her book about the outer planetary planets, transits of the outer planetary transits, about the heart and the mind. Neptune, of course, being the heart and Uranus being the mind. And I think he had a lot of trouble with his heart and his mind, and he was learning. Probably with that skip step ruling the south node, also being the resolution node, how he was going to really nurture people, be a leader, a nurturing leader, and also have that Uranus component, the freedom to be a genius, which I'm sure wasn't easy. And then Neptune in Libra, the third stage ruler, is in his second house, and it's in that chord with Saturn and Venus and the north node. And I think he was moving towards the third stage. I don't personally think he got there, but I don't know. Like, I don't know, okay? Because I never spoke to him. And I think if I had spoke to him, he says, oh yeah, I've been meditating since I was 20 and I went to India that first time, then I would be more inclined to go, oh, okay. But he never openly, or the things I read never openly discussed it. So I'm certainly sure that his capacity to invent something, that Uranus-Jupiter conjunct the south node, and give it to the masses is the interdependent stage of individuation, all right? And I remember hearing Jeffrey talk about all these guys being in this stage anyway. So I guess I'm a little bit influenced by that. At least I think that's so long ago that I'm pretty sure that's what it was all about. And you can see that they're all connected in this chord. I've talked about it, Jupiter and Uranus. Oh, we're moving on. Okay, so here's Rujar. And certainly Rujar was spiritual and second stage because of, I mean, I'm going to assume he was, because he wrote so many books. He's left such a legacy for young astrologers. And then let's look at this chart. It's fascinating. He's got a Pluto-Mars-Neptune conjunction. So Mars is in the new phase to Pluto in Gemini in the 6th house. So he's here to serve 6th house. He's here for his own self-improvement. He lived to be a very old guy, so I'm pretty sure he managed to stay healthy and self-improve because he lived so long. And then Mars is balsamic to Neptune. So in this balsamic phase, and I looked up something Jeffrey said, so just give me a second here. Ooh. Wow, I'm not going to be able to read it. I'm not able to minimize my screen. But anyway, he talked about the idealism of the balsamic phase. And I would think that this Mars-Neptune, Rudyard was very poetic and very long-worded, and his books are sort of hard to read sometimes because he uses so many amazing words. I mean, I remember I needed a dictionary the first time I read him. And I have a good vocabulary. I had a good education. I was like, whoa. I do not get this. Of course, it was way ahead. I started reading him in the 70s. And if you haven't read him, you know, he is definitely the godfather of modern evolutionary astrology and all good karmic astrology, all spiritual astrology. Everybody's read him. And he has said it first. So the balsamic Mars-Neptune was the poet in him. And the Mars-Pluto was the pioneer in him. And then I believe that in Gemini, he wanted to educate, he wanted to learn how, with Mars balsamic to Neptune, how to say the things in Gemini that were going to help really be understood by the following generations. And then there's Jupiter right on that galactic axis at 27 Gemini Sag, that galactic axis there. So, you know, it's very clear that he came in with a very strong intention to teach. And the North Node being in Pisces, some people could say Neptune was squaring it. It's only 8 degrees. So it's possible that the Neptune-Jupiter squares his, the midpoint squares his nodes. So he wanted to teach spirituality in a modern way to modern times. Because really the only tradition that had this level of spiritual content was the Vedic tradition. And when you study Vedic astrology, it's very materialistic. What's going to happen when? How many children? How much fame? How much wealth? Not that there isn't the transcendental, but they didn't use the Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto planets. So during his lifetime, they didn't use them. They've just begun to. So then his Pluto-Mars phase is new, and Mars is involved, Pluto and Mars are involved with Neptune and Jupiter. So the 3rd stage is involved with the Mars and the Pluto. And Saturn is up there in the 10th. And in Scorpio, I'm pretty sure he realized that he was a leader early on. I mean, he wrote and was considered a teacher and a leader from early on in his life. So I would give him, and I think this chart backs it up, the spiritual stage of the Pluto-Neptune conjunction with Mars involved in there. So I don't think his separating desires were very far away from his evolutionary desires. And in the balsamic phase, he had that real beautiful optimism and transcendence of having to bring that Mars energy in Gemini into that Neptune, into the spiritual. And then Jupiter is involved teaching natural law to others. And there you see a profile of a person, I think, who's pretty evolved. His Uranus in the 11th house is, you know, how much clearer can it get? He was an astrologer, Uranus in the 11th. And that would be the ruler of the 2nd stage. And it is, he does also have Moon in Aquarius, so, and Vesta in Aquarius. So I think it speaks very strongly to how he was going to affect and what his personal gift was going to be with Uranus. So if you're looking at a chart and you want to know how you're going to individuate, you might want to look at your Uranus and where Aquarius is, what house it's on. If you want to know where you need to follow the rules, you might want to look at where your Capricorn is, where your Saturn is, what house it's in. And if you want to look at where you should surrender and try to meditate and where your gurus might be, you could look at where your Neptune was. And so I guess this is our first example. Melanie, who has Neptune in the first house and Uranus in the 12th house and Saturn in the 10th house. So those would be the rulers of the stages. Now, Melanie, I don't know you. I don't even know what you look like. So I have never spoken to you, and I would never guess what stage you're in. Even because, just because you're here on an astrology conversation, I wouldn't even say you're in spirituality, stage 1. I just wouldn't do it. I've met so many people in the new age who work for Google and just go to a yoga class and burn a candle, and they think they're in that first stage, and I don't. But I think we're all in different stages all the time. If you wanted to assess your situation, you would look at freedom from the known in the 12th house. That would be at opposite Chiron. That would be breaking away, I think, from the old evolutionary paradigms and learning the new one. I think that's pretty clear. I have that, and I think all of us in evolutionary astrology, it was actually a huge kind of epiphany for me. Oh my God, we all have this Uranus reformation. We're all reforming astrology to natural law and putting it into English and standing on the shoulders of some giants and going forward, integrating some of the Vedic, taking Jeffrey's work, taking Dane Rudyard's work, and some other people's work, integrating things, synthesizing, and coming up with a much better way to do astrology. And I would imagine your individuation phase is discussed somehow in that Uranus-Chiron. Your Pluto-Mars is also new phase in different signs. So that would talk about also pioneering and doing something new, different. And in the 11th house, probably with the astrology community. And then Saturn, like Rudyard, you have it in the 10th. So leadership, perhaps a communicator, a writer. And maybe at that point, that would be where you might find some consensus. With the Saturn-Juno, you would have to be very self-empowered in all consensus situations. Okay, I've lost the pretty pictures. Okay, so Saturn, Juno, Saturn, Mercury, Moon, Pluto, Sun, Jupiter. Wow, that's quite a little stellium you have going there. Yeah, there's a lot going on there. So I'm sure there's a bunch of, Saturn is in the balsamic phase to Pluto, so I would imagine in the consensus area of your life, you have some completions. I would not know what they are without discussing them with you. And I certainly wouldn't be able to guess your stage because of this. But you see, what I hope that I'm showing you is how you can see a little bit of all of these stages that we're all working through, that we're all in.
Tashi, thank you so much.
How's our time?
I wish we could go on.
Oh, we're done.
We're done.
Are we done?
Yes.
Oh, we have 10 minutes. Do we have
It doesn't, it's